She was the girl no one ever noticed, sweeping floors silenced by sorrow, fading into the dust of a town that had long forgotten kindness. But then he rode in, quiet, watchful, and carrying nothing but mystery and a worn saddlebag. And with a single glance, everything began to change. Who was this silent stranger? And why did his presence make the world finally see her? If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from you around the world. Now let's jump into the story. The desert wind in Claybrush didn't whisper. It scratched. Dust clung to windows, drifted across porches, and slipped into every crack like it belonged there. For Mara, the girl who swept more than she slept, the dust was part of her skin now. It coated her shoes, her plain dress, and even the spaces between her thoughts. Mara lived at Grila's Rest, a weather-beaten inn on the edge of the forgotten town. It wasn't much. A place with creaky floors, sour soup, and beds that sagged like tired shoulders. But to Mara, it was all she had known since her parents were taken by the fever 3 summers ago. She was not a guest, not really a worker either. She was just there. A quiet figure, always holding a broom, carrying a bucket, scrubbing something. She moved like a shadow, always working, barely seen. Miss Grilla, the innkeeper, barked orders like she was still fighting in some invisible war. "Don't drag your feet, girl," she'd snap. "Dust's winning again and you're letting it." Mara never answered back. What was the point? The townspeople didn't notice her. They walked past her like she was part of the building, something old and worn and not worth fixing. If they did speak, it was usually to complain about lukewarm tea or ask for more towels. She dreamed quietly. In the middle of washing sheets or stirring stew, her thoughts would float far away. Sometimes she imagined herself somewhere green, sometimes just somewhere else. But on one dry, cloudless afternoon, something shifted in the wind. A rider appeared on the road, not fast, not loud, just steady. He was little more than a blur at first, a speck on the sun-baked trail. But as he drew closer, people turned to look. The man sat tall in the saddle, his shoulders calm, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. His horse, a strong gray mare, moved with patient grace. The man said almost nothing when he arrived. He dismounted, tied the reins outside the inn, and stepped inside without fanfare. Mara watched from the steps as he passed her. A bucket. In her hand, sweat on her brow and dust sticking to her face. He glanced her way just once, but that glance felt different. His eyes, deep and steady, didn't pass over her like she was furniture. They stayed, just for a second too long, as if he noticed her tired arms, the weight of her chores, and the tired light behind her eyes. Then he moved on. Later, Miss Grilla told Mara to ready the corner room. "He'll be here a while," she muttered. Didn't say much, just handed over the coins. "Quiet one, I like that." Mara swept and changed the bedding, her hands moving out of habit, but her thoughts were still on that glance. People didn't look at her like that, not with curiosity, not with something like understanding. In the days that followed, the man, his name was Calder, they learned, became part of the background of Claybrush, though never quite blending in. He spoke little, ate slowly, and mostly kept to himself. Some guessed he was a drifter. Others thought he was running from something, but no one knew. He didn't share stories and no one dared ask. Mara noticed the small things, how Calder's boots were worn but well cared for, how he brushed his horse each morning with quiet patience, how he always sat facing the door, like he was waiting for something or someone. One morning, Mara was struggling with a heavy bucket of water, arms shaking as she tried not to spill. The handle dug into her hand. She reached the top step and her foot slipped slightly. The bucket wobbled, then a hand, strong, calloused, sure, steadied it. Calder. He didn't speak, just helped her lift the bucket, held it with her until it was steady again. Then he nodded, a small dip of the head, and walked inside, Mara stood there for a moment, heart beating oddly fast. Her hand still felt the warmth where his fingers had brushed hers. No one had helped her carry anything in a long time. No one had paused to care. From that day on, things began to shift in small ways. She noticed a flower, a single bright bloom, placed on the windowsill of the tiny room she slept in. No note. Just the flower, vibrant and full of color in a place that barely had any. The plank outside her door, the one that always creaked and made Miss Greela yell, had been nailed down. Quietly. One morning, it just stopped creaking. And Calder? He never said much. But his eyes always found Mara, in the kitchen, on the stairs, by the stables. He looked, but never stared. He noticed, but never made a fuss. For Mara, who had lived so long being unseen, it felt like the beginning of something. Something she didn't yet have a name for. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the dust, beneath the chores, beneath the silence, a small part of her started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she mattered. Days in Claybrush often passed like clouds in the dry sky, slow, thin, and forgettable. But for Mara, things were starting to feel different, even if nothing looked different on the surface. She still swept the dusty inn floors. She still cooked meals that barely filled the belly. She still answered Miss Greela's sharp voice without protest. But inside, something had begun to stir. A feeling she didn't yet trust but couldn't ignore. And the reason was simple. Calder. The quiet man hadn't spoken more than 10 words since he arrived. Yet his presence was loud in her life. He didn't try to charm or flatter. He didn't demand anything from her. But when he looked at her, it was like he saw her. Not the dirt on her apron. Not the frizz in her hair. Just her. It started with small things. One chilly morning, as Mara stepped outside to collect firewood, she noticed the heavy stack had already been split and neatly arranged by the door. The axe still stood planted in the ground, but no one was in sight. She touched one of the pieces, still warm from the effort. That evening, while scrubbing pots in the kitchen, she found a little folded paper tucked beside the water bucket. It was a sketch, just pencil on old parchment, but detailed and careful. It was of a wild desert flower, the kind that bloomed for just a day after rare rainfall. On the back, in tiny handwriting, were the words, "They bloom even when no one is watching." She didn't need a name to guess who had drawn it. She kept the paper in her apron pocket all day. Later that week, she passed by the porch where the loose board always creaked under her weight. Only this time it didn't. She stepped back and forth just to be sure. Someone had fixed it. Quietly, without asking for thanks. She glanced toward the stables. Calder stood brushing his horse, calm as ever, but she could have sworn she saw the smallest tug of a smile at the corner of his mouth. He never asked for her attention, but he gave his in ways no one else ever had. Not everyone liked it. At the general store, a few rough men had taken notice. Young, loud, and full of mean laughter. They'd often jeer at Mara when she passed. "Hey there, broom girl," one of them had snorted. "Maybe that quiet cowboy's got a thing for dirt." Mara kept her head down, cheeks burning. She said, "Nothing," but this time Calder had followed her in. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply stood near her, tall and still, his eyes calm but firm. The laughter stopped. The men shuffled awkwardly, pretending to look at dry beans and bolts of cloth. One by one, they left. Mara stood there, unsure of what to say. Her hands trembled slightly, but not from fear, from surprise. "Thank you," she said quietly. Calder just gave a small nod, like it was nothing. But to her, it was everything. As days rolled into weeks, the silent connection between them grew stronger, not with grand speeches or bold actions, but with more quiet gestures. A clean cup of water left beside her bed, a pair of repaired laces for her worn shoes. One day, a small wooden carving appeared on the table by her room. It was shaped like a bird, wings outstretched, carved smooth and clean. She picked it up gently, her fingers tracing the feathers. She pressed it to her chest for a moment. eyes closed. For the first time in years, she smiled without forcing it. Calder remained calm and distant around others. He never made a show of anything. He nodded to townsfolk politely, helped Miss Grilla carry barrels when needed, and spent quiet evenings outside the inn, sketching in a notebook or tending his horse. No one dared to ask too many questions. But with Mara, something different showed. Not loud, not obvious, but present. She began to look for him, not in a needy way but in a hopeful one, like the sky looking for stars. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the world gold, Mara found herself sitting on the back steps of the inn, too tired to finish her chores. Calder was nearby, feeding his horse. Without a word, he sat beside her, just sat. For a while they said nothing. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable, it felt natural. Like two puzzle pieces finally resting in place. "I used to dream of being a teacher," Mara whispered, unsure why the words came out. "But I haven't said that out loud in years." Calder didn't speak, but she saw his head tilt slightly, listening. "I thought maybe if I could help someone else," she added softly, "I'd feel less invisible." He reached into his coat pocket and handed her a blank notebook and a pencil. Her fingers wrapped around it slowly. "Start," he said simply. One word. But it echoed louder than anything. In those quiet gestures, Calder wasn't just helping Myra survive. He was helping her remember who she was meant to be, and for the first time Mara felt like maybe, just maybe, her life could be more than sweeping floors and swallowing silence. Spring came quietly to Claybrush, not with a grand arrival but with small changes. The winds blew a little softer, the mornings carried a hint of warmth instead of chill, and at the edge of the town, wildflowers began to push through dry earth like secrets trying to bloom. Something else had begun to grow too. Inside Mara. It was slow, unsure, and still small. But it was there. A new sense of self. Like a fragile plant stretching toward sunlight. For most of her life she had been silent, unnoticed, and passed over. But ever since Calder arrived, something had started to shift. He never made promises. He never spoke sweet words. But his actions told her what no one else ever had, that she mattered. And now Mara was starting to believe it. At the annual town fair, the people of Claybrush gathered in the square, just as they did every year. There were pies to taste, music to hear, and ribbons to win. Mara, as always, was placed behind a table serving lemonade and wiping spills. No one thanked her. No one really looked at her, until she made a mistake. A boy bumped into her tray, and the lemonade pitcher slipped. The sticky liquid splashed across the table and down her dress. A hush fell. A stern woman nearby frowned deeply. "Careless girl," she snapped, her voice sharp as glass. "You're always underfoot." Mara's face flushed red. She bent quickly, grabbing a cloth, trying to wipe the mess. Her eyes stung, but she kept her head down. Then, out of the crowd, Calder stepped forward. Without a word, he knelt beside her. He took a clean towel and helped mop the lemonade, slowly, calmly, as if nothing was wrong, as if helping her was the most natural thing in the world. When the table was clean again, he stood, looked directly at the woman, and placed his own untouched plate of food in front of Mara. "Eat," he said gently. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy, like the whole town had suddenly realized something at once. In that moment, Calder had spoken more with a single act than most people did in paragraphs. People looked at Mara differently after that. A few offered smiles. Wannabe. The boys who used to laugh at her offered to carry a box later that week. Miss Grilla, though still sharp-tongued, didn't bark quite as often. But the biggest change wasn't in the town. It was in Mara herself. That night she sat outside the inn on the back steps. The air smelled of warm earth and wild sage. Calder sat beside her, as he often did now. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of comfort, understanding, and something unspoken but strong. She turned to him. "Why are you kind to me?" she asked, her voice barely louder than a whisper. He didn't answer right away. He picked up a small stone and turned it in his fingers. "Because I see you," he said simply. Tears touched Mara's eyes, but she didn't look away. She let herself be seen. "I used to be someone who spoke all the time," she said, surprising herself. "I used to tell stories to the children at the orphanage. I used to read out loud, even if no one was listening." She laughed softly, a sound she hadn't heard in a long time. "I think I stopped speaking because I thought no one cared." Calder looked at her, quiet as always, but with that steady, grounding gaze she had come to trust. "They do now," he said. That simple sentence hit her heart like sunlight breaking through clouds. Later that week, a traveling preacher came to town. He spoke of kindness, of seeing others as equals, of reaching out. But as he stood in the square, a sudden gust of wind blew his papers out of his hands. The crowd chuckled as the pages danced away like lost birds. Without thinking, Mara ran after them. Her dress whipped in the wind, her hair flying loose. She caught one, then another, but several floated too far. Before she could run again, Calder appeared on horseback. With calm precision, he steered his mare around the drifting papers, guiding them back toward her. It was almost like he was herding sheep, soft and sure. The town watched, surprised by the gentle grace of it all. When the final paper was caught, Calder passed it to her. Their fingers brushed. Her eyes met his. She smiled. A full, true smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear. And for once, the town listened. Mara was beginning to speak again, not just with words, but with confidence, and people were beginning to hear her. In the quiet care of a stranger, she had found something powerful, not just safety, not just kindness. She had found her own voice. The days in Claybrush began to feel lighter. The wind still carried dust and the streets were still worn from time and sun, but something in the air had shifted. It wasn't the town that had changed. It was Mara. She walked differently now. Her shoulders weren't always slumped. Her eyes didn't always stay on the ground. She had learned to meet gazes, to offer soft greetings, to carry herself with just a little more belief in her own worth. The townsfolk noticed. Maybe not loudly, but enough to nod when she passed, to say thank you when she refilled a drink or swept the porch. A few of them even asked her how she was doing. It was nothing grand, but it mattered. Calder, quiet as ever, remained steady by her side. He didn't speak more than usual, but he didn't need to. His kindness had never been in words. It had always been in what he did, and he kept doing those quiet things. One morning, Mara found him waiting at the garden patch behind the inn. It wasn't much of a garden, just a few flowers growing, where dry land allowed. But she had started tending it, little by little, watering it at dawn, pulling weeds with her bare hands. That morning, he handed her something wrapped in soft cloth. When she opened it, her breath caught. Inside was a small, carved wooden bird, its wings spread mid-flight. It looked so delicate yet strong. The details were carefully done. Tiny lines for feathers, a smooth curve of the beak. She had never owned anything so beautiful. "It's for you," Calder said, voice low and even. Mara held it carefully, like it might fly away. "No one's ever given me a gift before," she said, barely above a whisper. Their hands brushed as she took it. She felt a warmth rise from her fingertips to her chest. "They need water," Calder added, nodding at the flowers behind her. Mara smiled. It was such a simple sentence, but it meant more than it sounded. He wasn't just talking about plants. He was talking about her. Later that day, Calder asked to speak with Miss Grilla. The conversation was brief and behind closed doors. Mara didn't know what was said, but the next morning, her work list was shorter. Her meals were served at the table, not from a tray in the kitchen, and when someone made a rude remark, Grilla herself told them to hush. It felt strange at first, like wearing someone else's coat, but slowly, it began to feel real. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in warm golds and soft purples, Mara sat with Calder on the porch steps. He had brought her a small bundle of papers, blank pages, tied with string. "You should write again," he said. She looked down at the gift, then up at him. "Do you think I could?" she asked. His reply came without hesitation. "I know you can." That night, she wrote her first story in years. It wasn't long, just a short tale about a desert bird that no one saw until it sang for the first time. But she smiled the whole time she wrote it. The next morning, Calder stood outside with his horse, packed and ready. He turned toward Mara with the same calm, steady look he always had. But today there was something more in his eyes, a question. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he held out his hand, not in demand, not in command, just offering. Mara looked at his hand, rough and strong, the same hand that had steadied her water bucket, that had fixed her porch board, that had carved a bird and handed it to her with care. She looked down at her own hand, smaller, worn from work, but no longer shaking. Then she placed it in his. They didn't need to say goodbye to the town. There were no speeches, no tearful farewells. Just the two of them, riding out slow and steady into the open land. They passed the edge of claybrush where the wildflowers had begun to grow again. The sun warmed their backs and the silence between them felt full, not empty. Mara leaned gently against Calder as they rode, holding tight to the wooden bird in her pocket and to the quiet hope in her heart. She wasn't running from claybrush. She was moving toward something new, a place where she could write, a place where she could teach, a life where she could speak and be heard. And in Calder, she had found more than a man who noticed her. She had found a partner, a stillness that brought peace, a love that didn't need noise to be loud. As they rode farther, the dust behind them slowly settled, and ahead the road stretched wide, open, and full of light.